The European Open Source Academy, which was recently launched at the European Open Source Awards in Brussels in January, is a new institution that seeks to amplify the public recognition of open source software and hardware. It was established with the explicit goal of uniting distinguished individuals and organizations who have demonstrated exceptional commitment to advancing open source software and hardware across Europe. Founded with initial funding from the European Commission, the Academy is currently in a transitional phase towards becoming an independent foundation incorporated in Belgium. This structure will ensure close alignment with European institutions while supporting the Academy's vision of long-term sustainability and governance. The inaugural laureates of the European Open Source Awards, Daniel Stenberg, Amandine Lepape, Lydia Pincher, and David Quartielis, have become the founding members of the body. They have been hard at work in recent months trying to set up some of the new operational processes to get the Academy off the ground. More information will be shared in the coming months in the lead up to the next European Open Source Awards, which will take place on the 29th of January, 2026. But let's talk a little bit more about today's webinar. In recognizing and celebrating excellence in open source software and hardware, the Academy aims to also be a platform for thought leadership, policy engagement, and community development, particularly around key topics like open source AI and open source security, which we are advancing understanding of through this webinar series. Today's focus on open source and cybersecurity aims to do just that, lead the discussion, identify actionable insights, and engage the community around this topic. Let me give a little context on why it's so important for the open source ecosystem in Europe and why we've chosen to focus today's event on it. As we speak now, we find ourselves at a critical juncture. Open source has become the backbone of Europe's digital infrastructure, with over 70% of software in critical systems and public services depending on it. This reliance underscores both the promise and the challenges of securing and maintaining these shared resources and tools. And yet, the same software remains neglected and underinvested, with potentially huge implications for the infrastructure that depends on it. In today's political environment, open source is not merely a technical choice. It is a matter of digital sovereignty and resilience. It powers our economy and underpins everything from healthcare systems to financial markets to the International Space Station. But it also means that vulnerabilities in a single open source project can cascade across the entire ecosystem, turning what was once a niche technical issue or an individualized problem in a single community into a question of strategic importance. Today, we'll explore how cybersecurity is increasingly interwoven with the routine maintenance of open source projects, how Europe is responding to this reality with new policies and initiatives, and how proactive strategies, not just reactive fixes, are essential for long-term security of open source software and hardware, which are both at the core of the Academy's mission. To help make this case and give color to its real-world impacts, I'm delighted to have a diverse group of speakers with us, each bringing diverse expertise from different corners of the ecosystem, from maintainers and security practitioners to policy experts and voices representing industry. Together, we'll dive into the challenges and opportunities, and we'll consider how Europe can lead in maintaining and securing our open source dependencies. Let's get started. To start things off, we have Daniel Stenberg. Daniel is the president of the European Open Source Academy, and he will make some introductory remarks. A leading open source software developer, widely respected by his peers, Daniel is a recipient of the 2017 Pulham Prize for his work on curl. Curl is a computer program for transferring data to and from internet servers using various network protocols. And if you've ever used the internet, you will certainly have felt its impact. So Daniel's the perfect person to tell us about this topic. Daniel, you maintain curl, which supports a lot of the internet's infrastructure, actually. Could you talk a little bit more around the relationship between open source maintenance and security work? Like, what does security-related maintenance look like, and why is it so important? How does it differ from other types of maintenance work?
I will absolutely do that. So hi, I'm Daniel. I figured I would just show you some slides here to get everyone on board. So curl, as mentioned, I'm working on curl. Curl is an open source project. It's a small command line tool and a library to do internet transfers. Basically, that people typically don't understand what that is, but the internet transfers, sending data to and from devices across the internet. And as an example project, curl started as an idea, of course, as just scratching an itch back in the late 1990s. As an idea I had, it was a tiny toy thing that I wanted to do, and it took off from there, right? So the number of lines of code in the project has exploded. It started with 100 lines in 1996. It's now 180,000 lines. that's a little bit thicker than War and Peace novel in number of words. And number of authors that have been participating in this open source project, and since it's really a lot more people than just me involved, the blue line on top here is actually the number of people who have authored parts of the existing curl, right? So soon 1,400 co-authors of this product, and that means that the number of authors per month, as we can see on this graph, you don't have to do, it's just to show off. So yes, a lot of people every month, all the time, and we have then done a lot of releases over the years so that we keep up. That's what we do, right? And of course, when we do releases, this is a security related thing. Development security is tightly integrated. So maintaining and doing something, of course, we need to pay close attention to security. And of course, doing things, development, software, humans, we do mistakes, and we, of course, get those mistakes reported and fixed, and we do corrections and updates. So yes, we also have a number of security related incidents over the years that we keep on, trying to address, get better, fix, and iterate, and do it again. And that's the way we keep doing. And then, so approaching 30 years as a project, used in everywhere. We now run on basically any operating system you can think of, any CPU architecture that is 32-bit or larger, pretty much anything at all. We also run on 2 planets since a few years back. So then now this journey, all that work, all those people, all those sort of open source style, making it available for everyone, has literally made this into a product that runs in some 20 billion installations in more or less everything that is internet connected these days. I mean, there's at least a high probability that it actually runs curl. So I certainly know a lot about that, and all those time, all those contributors, all this work, all the security impact and everything, we're still at this point that I'm still the single full-time employee working on this thing that is now powering quite a lot of things out there. So yes, security is tightly integrated with maintenance, and highly important when shipping something that is used by so many. And as said, open source is also the only way to do something like this that helps the world iterate this fast and build infrastructure and build a world of internet and software, really.
Thanks for sharing a bit of your perspective. I know you wear many hats, and one of them is as president of the European Open Source Academy. So in your opinion, why should we care about this topic as the Academy? Why is cybersecurity a critical dimension of open source work, and what should the European open source ecosystem be doing to address it?
Well, pretty much sort of because, of course, I mean, as you already mentioned, open source is critical because everything is using open source these days. And I think we're only going to see even more open source going forward. And of course, we can talk about it with a European focus, but it's actually more of a global, this is how the digital current infrastructure of the world actually looks like. And we have a growing number of open source projects and software in general. Everything is turning smart, right? Smart means that there's software somewhere in devices. So we have more software, more open source. And so, of course, security is really important to make sure that all these devices, all these software packages and everything is secure and safe, so that we as users and society can, well, we can continue to have everything that we want to have in a safe and a secure way. So it's highly integral to just our current development of pretty much everything, because everything is using software these days.
Great, thanks. So we're going to give a little bit of shading to kind of the scale and scope of this challenge. And to do that, we have Mirko Bohm with us. Mirko is a free and open source software contributor, community manager, licensing expert, and research, who is now a senior director for community development at Linux Foundation Europe. Mirko, I know you're going to present some findings from a report that LF worked on, but I wanted you to maybe just first kind of reflect briefly on kind of the question of, how can we understand the relationship between open source maintenance and critical infrastructure dependencies? What have you been learning in your work at the Linux Foundation? And how have you come to think about this topic?
So the first thing that comes to mind here is that we have come to an incredible extent to rely on open source components running our infrastructure, kind of without being fully aware of it. It happened over time, similar to the story that Daniel's told of like how curl's been developed over decades now. Many components that we know and love have this kind of history and have become the backbone of the internet. Similarly, if you look at what runs clouds these days, or what is used to route traffic on the internet, all of that is open source software. And that creates a very, more or less, a special relationship between the maintenance of open source software and cybersecurity. And I think when we talk about cybersecurity, we should probably mentally separate between accidental mistakes that need to be fixed as part of a regular maintenance process, but also about the resilience of our infrastructure against malicious attacks and other things. And for that, we need to be sure that the software is safe to operate and that issues that are found, because they're inevitably there, are fixed in a timely manner. And this creates an impetus for the public side also to participate in funding the maintenance, because this aspect of it's not just software we run, it's actually our infrastructure, is becoming crucial to being able to rely on digital infrastructure and to attain digital sovereignty, basically.
Great. And now you're going to show us some current trends and kind of insights that you have generated from a maturity report that the Linux Foundation has authored. I'll send it over to you and you can share your screen and talk a little bit more about the scope of the challenge.
Okay, 1 second. I'm wondering to share. Here we go. Do you see the presentation?
Yes, we do.
Okay, it's actually there are 3 critical insights here on the relationship between cybersecurity and open source software, and they come from 3 different reports that I would like to highlight. And for background here, what we do at the Linux Foundation is we do basically research into the health of our communities and the sentiments of our participants, and based on that, we publish that through our Linux Foundation research outfit. We make all these reports available under Creative Commons licenses. So everything you hear now is something where you can then look into the details of the reports. The first insight, that's from the maturity report that Nick has mentioned, is that there is an actual opportunity to attain cybersecurity leadership by adopting and operating open source software-based solutions. There are three critical insights here. One is that the trust in open source security reached a very high level in 2024. This report was collected and published in 2024. 76% of the respondents say that they trust in the security of open source software more than in the security of proprietary alternatives. You may recall that for a long time there has been this debate, is open source software maybe more vulnerable because you can actually research how it works and find cybersecurity vulnerabilities as opposed to proprietary software. And I think if you look at these numbers, this debate is essentially over. Way more people believe that a transparent and collaborative development process leads to more secure software, especially through transparency. The vulnerability detection works much better in open source software compared to closed source alternatives, and the community-driven security reviews outpace the alternatives of closed source software. And another highlight is that the public money, public code principle is now supported by over 80% of respondents. That means a very strong majority believes that if the public invests into the development of open source infrastructure, software, that, or if the public invests into infrastructure software, that should be open source. I think that speaks a little bit for the success of the campaigning that the open source community has done on this topic. And this is from this report that was published in September 2024. And I'm giving a link at the end of the presentation where you can find them on the internet. The second insight is that we see multiple projects that are kind of role models for maintaining cybersecurity, taken very seriously, maintaining it in the development process. And besides curl that you already have heard of, we've analyzed here 3 projects: the Civil Infrastructure Platform, Yocto project, and Zephyr project. And all of them stand out with basically exemplary cybersecurity processes. And why is this important? Because all these projects are collaboratively run, community-driven open source projects, meaning that the way they maintain their cybersecurity and the processes that they apply, the learnings from that, and all of that is available to study and basically replicate. So I would really recommend to look into how these projects have established such a high level of awareness and level of maintenance on their security posture. The Civil Infrastructure Platform for 10 years now maintains critical components in an open development process with a very long-term perspective, like literally decades of running the software. The Yocto project basically pioneered processes like verifiable builds. And the Zephyr project, for example, is one that runs its own product security incident response team. So again, I think this is primarily an opportunity to study the learnings and the processes that these projects have developed over time and see if they can be adopted. Why is this important? The graphic that you see on the right side is one of the infographics from the report, where we basically say that the open source community sees the Cybersecurity Act as an opportunity to strengthen cybersecurity. It's kind of a nudge for everybody to, basically take inventory of their current posture and improve it. And that can be supported by learning from successful open source projects here. So here, this is the report I'm talking about. It was published in March, almost 3 months ago, and I'm one of the authors on it. And then the third insight, and this is kind of a little bit of a gateway into the panel discussion later, is that we seem to have a readiness crisis when it comes to cybersecurity. The infographic here is also from the report I'm quoting now, shows that almost half the manufacturers that were participating in this survey passively rely on upstream open source projects for their security fixes. Now, this is something that, as a habit, has developed over time. Many manufacturers work this way, but we have to understand that with the requirements that simply a better level of cybersecurity maintenance imposes, but also with the details that are in the Cybersecurity Act, achieving, for example, the maintenance of cybersecurity vulnerabilities, the fixing over longer support periods, 5 years or more, cannot be done by simply relying on upstream projects to do the work for you. These projects might go away in that time. If you look at the bullets to the left, 62% of open source developers are unfamiliar with the cybersecurity regulations that affect their work. Only 1/4 understands the compliance timeline of the Cybersecurity Act. And many people just don't know cybersecurity regulations apply to them. This runs the risk that they will leave critical vulnerabilities, but also process challenges unaddressed, basically missing the boat on improving cybersecurity. And this is from the third report here that was also published in March. And with that, I would like to close and turn over back to Nick. And the links here are where you can find the reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirko. So next up in our discussion, we have Dr. Melanie Rybak. Melanie is a leading expert at the intersection of open source and cybersecurity. She is the co-founder and CEO of Radically Open Security, which is the world's first nonprofit computer security consultancy company. Melanie, I thought you would bring a very specific perspective to this discussion. So you have a lot of insight from your work on how many projects are thinking about the day-to-day of open source security, and you've consulted with a lot of projects working directly on these types of issues. Could you first talk a little bit more around the work you do with radically open security, the approach you take, and how it supports open source projects on some of these objectives?
Yes, of course. So my name is Melanie Ryback, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Radically Open Security. We are an 11-year-old pen testing company in the cybersecurity space. We're set up as a steward-owned company, so we're foundation-owned, and we also give 90% of our profits to the NLNet Foundation. So, and we've given them over 1 million euros over the last 10 years. So beyond that, we do a lot with open source security, not the least of which is being quite integral participants in the NGI Zero initiative. So I would say that probably roughly 1/3 of our clientele is either nonprofits, NGOs, civil society organizations, or open source projects. And in that sense, we also in part through NGI Zero, but we've also been in the Mozilla Open Source Security Project. We've also worked for a long time with Open Tech Fund. That's also put us in touch with a lot of open source. So in that sense, another thing I should mention is we also work at cost price on a zero margin basis also for nonprofit projects. So, and that's also useful to know. Beyond that, security-wise, we see a lot of open source projects, and we've also done a lot of audits. We've also disclosed quite a number of 0 days. You can also see some reports on our webpage, and we've also got some number of CVEs. What I notice, I think, about open source itself is that what we find really depends on the team. Because, of course, you have some organizations which tend to be small and highly technical. You also have other organizations which are larger, more corporate, and oftentimes just have a far greater attack surface. Now, I think that open source in that sense is very much like everything else. Of course, the larger the organization that is writing the code and maintaining things, then of course, on the one hand, the more problems we're likely to find just due to the sheer complexity of the number of lines of code. I mean, given that I think it was 16 bugs or for every 1,000 lines of code is statistically what we typically would find. Then, of course, as the project becomes more complex, then, of course, just naturally, we're going to find more. But this also requires more structure. With the larger organizations, they also tend to have better processes. With smaller organizations, on the other hand, they don't really have a lot. And I think also with the smaller organizations, they're also not really sure when to bring us in. Because what I've also noticed with NGI is that, a budget is available basically for them to bring in a security company, and a lot of them just want to wait until after they've implemented something without understanding that once they actually implement something, then of course, if we find problems, it could, excuse me, it could architecturally be difficult for them to make those fixes. Of course, there's also sunk cost. Whereas if they actually bring us in the earlier stages, we might be able to also help them with preventing some of these architectural issues in the first place. So, but that being said, like I've seen all kinds of junk, with open source and with like how people tend to use it. I've seen SMEs that have no idea what they're doing. Basically fork open source projects and then start using them internally without realizing that you actually need to merge patches from upstream. And then of course I wind up getting the ransomware call. So I do see things like that, and people are inclined to use open source, but of course they need to have a understanding of how to maintain it once they're using it. The smaller players, they also have little to no understanding of hosting. And sometimes, again, with the really small ones, I hate to say it, but sort of in the best case scenario, they give it to big tech. Which, with all the usual governance issues that we're used to. But at the same time, though, the worst case is if they just either try and maintain it themselves without actually understanding how to properly maintain the platforms, or worse yet, just outsourcing it to some like uncles, cousins, brothers, who happens to have a server in the closet somewhere. And at this point, of course, I've been around for so long that pretty much nothing surprises me anymore. With the larger companies, of course, it's different. Of course, then you start thinking more just about siloing of the organization and how exactly they're supposed to be triaging bug reports, and how they can actually go after certain business units that have vulnerabilities and who actually pays, organizationally speaking, for them fixing it. So, I mean, it's just entirely different sets of issues depending on who we're talking to. But also things like the dependency chains, I think still, a lot of larger organizations are just unaware sometimes of how much open source really is running under the hood. I mean, of course, occasionally there's exceptions, as soon as we get things like, I don't know, Log4Shell or something, then suddenly the awareness is there for a little while. But beyond that, though, yeah, it's the other problem I really think that there is just financial support for the ecosystem. Because, of course, given the fact that a lot of this open source is supporting critical infrastructure, it's like that usual XKCD comic with the Jenga tower, and then that one little block off to the side that's basically this developer somewhere in an attic in Kansas or something. I mean, that's basically what it is. And just also them not really understanding that, as they're allocating budget for, their own internal cybersecurity, that it also helps if they can occasionally support the projects they're relying on, and or just contributing things back to upstream if they also make relevant fixes. So, so I think in general, just with open source, I mean, there's more issues. Funding, of course, we're in weird political times at the moment, and of course, funding is shifting. Some things are getting defunded, some things are drying up. Even NGI 0. Some of the funding has gotten shifted to other things just for political reasons. So I think that is definitely a threat. Not to mention just, weird, partisan politics in the States. And, I mean, even hearing rumors that, the US government might even create some local forks that they're maintaining of certain open source projects because they want to basically fork away from the main projects because of DEI policies. It's, we're in a crazy world today. So, but of course, that kind of stuff would have a really huge impact on the ecosystem, because if suddenly we're starting to deal with large federal forks of open source projects, then that too is going to affect things. So, I mean, but beyond that, I mean, I think a lot of what I see is just with open source is just sort of the usual stuff that I also see with the proprietary software, all the usual, input validation errors and buffer overflows and all the usual things. So, so I guess that for now is probably it with the view from where I'm standing on open source, and I guess we can chat about it a little bit more later.
Yeah, I have a lot of follow-up questions, but I do want to make sure we get Matteo in before the panel. So finally, we have in our initial kind of round of questions, Matteo Molle, who is Manager for Cybersecurity Technologies and Innovation at the European Cybersecurity Organization, or the ECSO. There he engages a lot with ECSO members around topics, including open source and cybersecurity. So Matteo, at the ECSO, you work a lot with your members who represent a wide range of industries and communities across Europe, including the open source ecosystem. There are a lot of regulations being passed in the last few years, and the fact is that open source itself is increasingly being regulated. So there's more scope than ever for understanding the relationship between open source security and the cybersecurity regulation landscape. How does the ECSO see the integration of open source security into the broader kind of European cybersecurity strategies like the CRA and the NIS2 directive? What have you been hearing from your members, and what are some of the key successes and challenges you've been observing?
Yes, thank you, Nick. So I'm a bit of an outsider from the rest of the crowd. I had experience in the cybersecurity industry, but not necessarily directly with the open source. And at EXO, we represent, I would say, in large part, the cybersecurity industry, cybersecurity manufacturer providers, so the one that are impacted a lot by recent regulation, with strong ties with the current EU administration in understanding where the legislation goes. But also we represent academia, RTOs, and public administration. And if I had to just stop my intervention here, I would basically quote Melanie, saying that what I notice or haven't noticed is basically awareness from the industry. So I would say that what we heard from our members mirrors a bit the reaction from the regulators in Europe, meaning that in the first place, the open source part was not perceived as an issue. Now we're starting to see, as the European Union stepped in and really started to get involved massively in the last few years. Also, we start to hear from our members, tell us more what that entails in that regulation and so on. But as Melanie was saying many times, and if we segment the market also in smaller players, I would say sometimes the silence we hear is the fact that basically people are not even aware of where they have the open source dependencies. So with the Cyber Resilience Act, we've been focusing a lot in recent years. Open source invited itself in the room because suddenly everyone understood that there's a open source. Many people understood that there's an open source code infrastructure, and if you skip these, basically you're gonna go nowhere. Because of that, we started to receive questions from our members, and we also started to be involved with the open source foundations way more. And mainly in the context of the Cyber Resilience Act, in essence, you're saying to manufacturers, and you want to create this trickle-down effect, but basically the manufacturer put the product into the market, is going to go down in upstream and in his supply chain and say, okay, what can I trust? Who are my vendors? Who need to fix what? Who needs to, to do his due diligence on what? So it suddenly becomes an interest also to go upstream up to the open source code. So CRA has been a big opportunity for this discussion. There's been a lot of discussion recently, and that's where our members are getting more excited about. I still would say there's a challenge in the sense that my feeling is that especially manufacturers, at the end of the day, and I understand that they want to place a product in the market to make the revenue. So affix the CE mark, right? So at the end of the day, manufacturers want to respect the regulations so they can keep doing their business. So open source is one of the areas, one of the problems, let's say, not necessarily the most pressing one. But I'd like also to say that the interest on software supply chain security started at IXO before, and that's why we had some discussions about it that stem in a report. I will share with you, Nick, the details, but a technical paper actually last year on software supply chain security, where we identified with academia and ecosystem and manufacturers some of the problems with dependencies, including open source dependencies. And then I would like maybe to add the last point, which is maybe new and interesting. In EXO, we have a number of different activities. And one includes also how to raise funding. And we had some discussion on how open source is starting to become perceived as a business model, something you can raise capitals on or start a business with.
Great. I want to move into our panel discussion now, and I think I wanted to pick up on something that Mirko had said earlier, which is, do we have a readiness crisis? I think there's growing complexity of open source software dependencies and software supply chains. So yeah, given that, is there a readiness crisis? And if so, how should regulators be responding to these new challenges to ensure security, but also continued innovation through open source? Mirko, maybe you could start off.
Yeah, I was holding back a little bit because I posted as do we maybe have a crisis? I think from what also the other speakers said, I think we do. Our survey into the readiness for the implementation of the Cybersecurity Act was not meant to show that only a quarter were aware of what's coming, but it did show that, and it was a bit of a surprise to us. And what Melanie said is that you have like established companies who run digital service in a pretty just naive way, or for open source dependencies and then forget to maintain them and things like that. And I think this is primarily a crisis of awareness and of expertise, frankly, at the level where we depend on organizations to maintain cybersecurity for themselves. So from my perspective, yes, let's call it a crisis. Yes, it's there. The Cybersecurity Act is mostly the thing that makes it visible and transparent. You asked, like, what should the public sector do here, governments? I think, building awareness and actually setting regulation that forces people to take it seriously is helpful. But I think the call is still for communities and industry also to basically do their part here, because they run way more services than the public.
Daniel, you had your hand raised. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I think there's a sort of a crisis, but I don't think it's a new crisis. I think it's just, this is a thing this is as old as software and internet or open source is. It's going bigger because we have more software than ever before. That's why it's a bigger problem. But I also want to just make sure that we scope this correctly, because I think most of the crisis is not within the open source itself, because generally open source is pretty well done. And in almost all these major crises that we can look back in the past couple of years, even, Heartbleed and Log4Shell, Shell Shock, we can even include the XZ attack and all of those. In almost every case there, the open source projects actually fix the problems in a really short time. I mean, in some of the cases, even impressively fast. And so that was not the problem, really. Possibly they could have identified the problem earlier. But anyway, when they sort of were alerted, the alarms were sort of shouting, and then they fixed the problems really fast. But what happens next? There's an industry with a lag that is, sometimes it takes years for them to actually deploy these fixes, and then are known and propagated over time and time and time. So the crisis has existed for a long time, but it's really in the manufacturer line, all those companies that are making services and products using these open source, because they have for so long just been casually using things. They haven't been sort of forced to do anything. They can just, we'll sell a new product in 2 years, so we don't have to fix these things. So we have sort of the legislation and the sort of market has, we as a world have allowed the manufacturers to do it like this.
Mirko, you looked like you wanted to respond.
First of all, I wanted to agree with Daniel. This is not a new crisis, and we should probably, I think, separate the know your dependency crisis from the maintain your cybersecurity crisis. Both exist, and exist for a long time, and they're not so specific problems. Basically, every digital product that you get today will contain critical open source components. As we heard, curl is one of them, and that means the separating between open source security and cybersecurity is going to be very, very difficult in the future. And the other thing we need to keep in mind is that a cybersecurity vulnerability manifests itself as a software attribute in a certain environment. Like, is it exposed? Is it exploitable because the port is exposed? Software at rest doesn't have security vulnerabilities, basically, right? You have to run it. And that is not something that open source communities do for you. That is something that the manufacturers built into the product, and then the product is used whether they're deployed or in the hands of consumers. And this combination is, I think, this is key to understand if you ask, where should a cybersecurity vulnerability be fixed? yeah, so that was my kind of agreement with Daniel and extension on his argument.
Yeah, some useful additions on the framing of the question. Matteo, you wanted to come in?
If I can, but just 2 seconds. I mean, I agree with the previous intervention. I think, especially in economics thinking, we often see manufacturers the black box, or we just channel everything there. I would say what I perceive now is that there are a lot of regulation, especially in Europe, they're trying to incentivize this due diligence to make sure that all this stuff gets fixed. What we're trying to keep an eye on and pay attention to is that the regulation is applicable and implementable. That's why a lot of work has been done on implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act, for instance. And so we can say that there's a lot that needs to be done by the manufacturer. We need to make sure that this is feasible. And there's also, some of you said, that is understood, because there's also lack of skills and understanding in the manufacturing world. We found that in the regulatory bodies, but also in the manufacturing side. You will be surprised how many people, as you said, probably are just using these things. So I think we need to find a balance, I would say, between stick and carrots, because if we only use sticks, I'm afraid, or I hear that some manufacturers are simply saying sometime, well, let's go out of the market, right? Let's not sell in that market anymore. That's just something to flag out. I'm not taking a position here, but just something that I hear from the manufacturers.
Melanie, you had your hand up?
Yeah, so another thing that I'm thinking about is just longevity and maintenance of projects. Because, of course, you also have a lot of sort of small code bases where people started. I mean, it could be things like grad students, even. And the project is around for a certain while. And then at a certain point, just the project is abandoned. I mean, usually it's because the money runs out. But then you've basically at this point got this abandoned code base, but people might like it and people might continue using it. But if it's not actually being actively maintained, then of course this is a huge invitation for hackers in your system. So this is a problem. I think another problem perhaps is also the abandonment of community editions of open source projects in favor for enterprise editions. And you see this also with, yeah, I would say very frequently VC funded larger open source projects because they start migrating in a freemium direction. And they start basically putting a lot of essential things behind a paywall, which could even include like temporarily fencing off certain kinds of software updates. Not to mention, eventually, it could be that they might just completely strand the community edition, but people might continue using this because, well, I mean, we like free as in beer, right? So, but this, of course, is a really huge problem because, of course, using end of life software without it sometimes even being clear that it's past end of life, this is extremely dangerous. So.
I next wanted to come to the question of the Cyber Resilience Act. So we mentioned that open source software is increasingly being regulated, and one of the ways that is happening is via the CRA. Could you all kind of talk about, kind of the implications that the CRA has had for the open source security ecosystem, and then maybe also kind of the cybersecurity perspective in terms of kind of the macro level as well? Yeah, Matteo.
I don't know. We could speak for hours, but maybe I'll just give my perspective as high level. I've been talking and writing and reading about the CRA for the last year and a half, and in essence, is a big incentive step forward to, in my view, to increase the security posture of the digital market, of all the product with digital elements, as the CRA called them, that are sold in the European market. He has a lot of, I think it gives a good signal and shows a lot of good directions and where to go. And he creates a lot of, at least we're trying to create a shared responsibility environment where all the supply chain stakeholders that are involved in the production of a product with digital element will do their due diligence to make sure that each component is secure, because each one will go and ask the previous one. Now, you reach up a point where you go to, that's my understanding, to the open source communities, and then basically you say, can you please fix this, or can you provide me some paper that says that this component is secure? and then you find someone that says, sorry, I'm on holiday, or basically I was just doing it in my free time. So that was, to me, the way to summarize it. But obviously the Cyber Resilience Act has been taking into account that. I'm heavily involved now in the drafting of, for instance, the harmonized standard of the Cyber Resilience Act, and we're getting a lot of open source contributor in there. I would say the Cyber Resilience Act is trying to create this positive effect without disrupting the ecosystem that is there for the open source communities. Now, and I think also that's why you created the academy, or we're having all this discussion. There is a bit of a question of where are the resources, who's funding, who's providing the money for these communities. In some way, some manufacturer might be interested in that because they will want to make sure that their supply chain upstream is secure. So they will probably have if they are aware that they have open source libraries, they will have probably a stake in saying, can you please fix this? But sorry, I'm diverging a bit from the question on the Cyber Resilience Act, but that's, to me, that's the main point of where it focuses on the open source communities. What I can say, as I said before, the main big attention that we perceive that is grabbing the CRA is really on the conformity part, because essentially now you're saying legally to the manufacturer, you need to be compliant. And all the discussion, I would say 80% of the discussion I'm involved in revolves around how can I show compliance, what type of compliance route do I need to perform. And then sometimes, okay, we squeeze in open source as well. But open source is really, in practice, very, very, very present. And maybe let me say one last thing, and it's more of a question than a remark or a suggestion that I keep having, which is, I understand that there's a light touch regime in the Cyber Resilience Act, so developers shouldn't really shouldn't be afraid of anything. But that's, to me, a question that I received from some manufacturers. If this is a public infrastructure for us, if it's so important, we're not even aware that this is there, how can we make sure that this infrastructure is not disrupted? Is it money is a problem, but what other tools are out there, maybe not monetary means, to make sure that these communities are still working in a safe space and not necessarily being scared or receiving the famous lawyer letter? So that's more of a question that I have, because we talk a lot about money, and then I know how it works in Brussels. We tend to start with buzzwords, talk about funding, money, and a lot of this stuff, but then that's something that to me is still a bit maybe an open question. Sorry, but if you have questions on CRA, feel free to shoot. I'm tattooing the text on my left arm now.
Daniel, you looked ready to respond. You came off mute.
Yeah. So I think the CRA has a great potential to push exactly that responsibility to manufacturers, and I think manufacturers should be a little bit concerned, and they should be looking into, hey, what are all these components that we are using and have been using for years to ship and earn a lot of money, and starting now to get a little bit worried that some of them are not up to snuff. Yeah, that's just about time to think about that. And yes, you're relying on 22 software components that were abandoned 3 years ago. 2 of them are still maintained, 3 of them maybe not. So ideally here, the manufacturers will start to realize that. They will start to help enforce the proper open source projects that they still deem sensible to use and reliable, and these are the ones that we're going to use in our products in the future. Hopefully also identify those 3 in the bottom end that we should stop using because they were abandoned 17 years ago and no one should use them. And then ideally, if in the open source world, we should get help from these manufacturers because they are using our software. So this in their interest that our software is better and we fix our problems. So ideally, they will help us out and we will get better software together. And I would also just want to throw in then that because I, as an open source developer, and for open source in general, the CRA is actually not impacting open source that much, other than indirectly via all the manufacturers, because most open source, basically 99 point something of every open source project is not going to be effective. We're not going to be manufacturers. We're not going to be stewards. We're just going to be not directly affected by the CRA.
Mirko, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I agree with that. Now, an open source foundation is a steward, right? So we are affected by this here, and this is where the light touch regime comes in. And still, I think that the Cyber Resilience Act is mostly to the benefit of the open source ecosystem. And yes, it puts the burden on the manufacturers, but frankly, that's where it should be, because the manufacturers are the ones making final products and bringing them into the market. So that makes sense. I think there are a couple of additions I would like to make. One is that this is really the time for the manufacturers to smarten up about open source development. Supporting your dependencies and with long support periods is best done upstream first. It's a shared investment. This calls for more active engagement in upstream communities. And this will, if manufacturers embrace that approach, this will lead to a lot of contributions and security fixes that end up directly in the maintained products and are then rolled out, hopefully, to wherever they're used. I think one thing to keep in mind is that with support periods just prescribed as 5 years or longer, it's not just enough to maintain components. It's also important to think about dependency transitions, where you say if a component is end of life and a new technology comes up, your architecture of your product needs to be made in a way that you can replace a component with a newer generation of how things are done. And this is a tougher architectural requirement for a software project or a hardware project than just updating a maintenance a dependency to a new maintenance release. And one thing I would like to add is that for projects that grow basically to have this kind of digital infrastructure character, often these projects start out small and modest, and they get widely adopted. And then all of a sudden they have this kind of character. For these projects, the governance demands are growing because basically manufacturers will say, I can only adopt the project to have this, like to rely on it really heavily, if it is governed in a way that I can ensure that it can be maintained for 5 years or longer, and that I can influence its development roadmap. And I see this a little bit as a risk for hobbyist contributors or developers who often start the innovative projects that they are going to face like a glass ceiling as their projects become more successful to build up governance structures around their technical work. Thank you.
And then Melanie.
Yeah. So we're doing a lot of talking about the CRA, but so far we also haven't mentioned NIS2. And this, of course, also is greatly going to affect those of us who are making open source, especially on a commercial basis, because, of course, this also makes us part of the critical supply chains. And of course, with NIS2, it's now really affecting also even the smallest of SMEs. That and by definition, with open source, I mean we are part of the supply chains. So this definitely is also going to have an impact, and this is also completely unclear at the moment about how especially smaller, not very well-funded organizations are even supposed to comply with NIS2. So I mean, this is going to be something, I guess, that will have to unfold over the next over the next decade probably. So beyond that, also, I mean, of course, I should probably mention it briefly, even though we haven't really gone into it and we don't really have time, but also, of course, the whole issue of software bill of materials, and also just the understanding that I think we also need to create tools, preferably at some point, clearly standardized ones, preferably open source. I mean, of course, things are migrating in this direction at the moment, but all the same, if we really want to be able to track our supply chain dependencies, then I think ensuring that we have a continued focus on this is also important.
Matteo, brief follow-up or response, and then I want to go to a couple audience questions.
Yeah, I'm just gonna basically, Melanie already took the thing I wanted to say about SBOM that are mandated in CRA, but in particular, I was going to mention NIS2, just to say that the perspective of manufacturers and in industries that basically, even though the CRAs can enter into force in 2 years, they're just looking at the next 3-4 months, how to survive, right? And say, what's coming to force, NIS2, boom, are we okay with that? Then CRA, some CISOs told me, we'll think about it. So we need to, in my view, what's going to be a success story is to make sure all this discussion and these cybersecurity good practices, including the open source, become a selling differentiator, become something that the manufacturer can show they're doing, and it's become value added. That's really going to be the big driver, rather than necessarily a law. The law are trying to create this good dynamic, but in the end, it's the market is going to drive it, in my opinion.
So as we finish up, and we only have a few minutes left, I want to come back to this idea that there's a few different types of challenges, and they kind of are interlocking. One is kind of this idea of knowing your dependency in the first place. Another is around the idea of routine maintenance. Is that actually the issue that we should be concerned about? And then another is the idea of kind of infiltration. So someone in the chat, Levon, had a question for you, Daniel. They mentioned that they think there was a case with a threat actor infiltrating the Linux kernel codebase and sending malicious commits. Do you see this as a threat for open source software and for curl in particular? And if so, how confident are you that CI tests or scanners can catch such types of infiltrations?
Yeah, I would say the XZ utils attack is the best example of someone who actually managed to do it to some degree, at least him. So it's certainly a potential attack vector. So that's something that, I mean, any open source project should just be aware of and think about, and make every precaution that we can do to discover it. So we have all these systems in place to make sure that it shouldn't be possible. You know, all these reviews, testing, scanning, signing, reproducing, and all of that. Sort of all the best practices you should do in your project, you should do them. And then actually, and people like to bring up that as an example because it's a horrifying example, but in reality, it's super hard to do that. And it's not typically it's not what most projects are going to suffer from. I mean, the most security problems we have is those unintended mistakes that we ship, and that they are far more often common and easily happening, and they happen all the time. These implants attacks, they are really hard, and they're more once every few years.
Great. And then we had one other question from Priyanka, which was, are there any sets of recommended tools or websites from where latest tools can be used for compliance monitor? I would love to know how to report such bugs. Yeah, Daniel, anyone else, anything that jumps to mind? Okay. Well, we're running out of time, so I wanted to maybe give a chance to everyone to say a few brief kind of final remarks. So yeah, Daniel, anything you wanted to say in summary as we wrap up?
Not really. Just that security and open source and development, it all goes hand in hand, and it's something that we've been working on for a long time. So we're just going to continue to do that and try to tighten everything a little bit better every time we iterate, and we keep on releasing, fixing everywhere, and so does all of us. So I think we're moving ahead. We're improving the world a little bit at the time.
Mirko, Matteo, anyone else?
I can add just a few closing comments, kind of calls to actions. For organizations, businesses, and other institutions, I think it is important to assess their readiness and basically develop strategies to implement the CRA as a starting point, but generally overcome this awareness issue of awareness and expertise issue of how do we deal with open source dependencies and how do we ensure cybersecurity. I think for policymakers, it's important to continue to support open source development with guidance and ideally funding. And I know people are working on this. I think this makes sense, especially where it becomes critical infrastructure, digital infrastructure. And especially where maybe the open source ecosystem is threatened by malicious actors, which is more like a external security question for me than a community governance question. And for the community, really, I think we need to continue to share knowledge, to adapt proven practices that have been successful in various places, to learn from each other, and basically play to our own strength, which is essentially collaboration.
Great. Brief final remarks, Melanie, Matteo?
Sure. So, another thing that there isn't time to discuss, but I think is important, is just understanding that in the world that we're in today, governance and business models matters for open source. I mean, it's actually completely frightening, particularly for things like AI. I mean, I know this isn't an open source example, but like when Elon Musk wanted to acquire OpenAI, I mean, that's just terrifying. So I think we need to, moving forward, also understand that if we want to actually keep our digital commons in the commons, I think it's actually really important to also teach open source founders how to apply business models for the commons, such as steward ownership with strong asset locks. And we could spend an entire other hour talking about that, but I think it's a really important piece that we need to spread awareness of for the integrity of our open source software moving forward.
Matteo?
Well, I don't think I have much to add, to be honest. Maybe just my perspective as a non-technical, been involved with the industry for a while, is that there's another task that sounds simple, but it's not, which is bringing together basically people like this. Sometime I think if we had brought together some stakeholders, especially with the expertise of open source in some fora earlier, basically we wouldn't have some problems. Or I'm just saying it's difficult to put the people who are trying to solve the same problem, same issue in the same room. It's difficult to overcome the different language we're using. But as personally, I've been thrilled because I've learned a lot working with the open source communities. But that's really a lesson learned, I would say, from the current regulatory evolution. And I mean, the EU regulator is probably the one in the world that is doing much effort in bridging this gap.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our distinguished panel of guests. This has been the second webinar from the European Open Source Academy.